to the Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Hosted by John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hi, this is Dave.
And this is John.
And welcome to episode 13 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Ooh, scary episode 13. Today we'll be interviewing John Langan. He's a new, very exciting new horror writer. And so we thought it would be really good to have him on for episode 13.
Nicely appropriate. It wasn't by accident or anything.
Yeah, I was about to say, we didn't plan it like that. But you can just assume anything we do, we didn't plan it like that because we don't plan anything. But it worked out really nicely. And John Langan is a really fun, interesting guy. So we're really happy he could join us. He's the author of his first novel, House of Windows, is out from Nightshade Books. And he had a recent collection called Mr. Gaunt and Other Uneasy Encounters. And actually, he's a professor at SUNY New Paltz, and he organized a conference years ago called the Fantastic Genres Conference, which was actually the first place that John and I really hung out. You know, we had met at the Science Fiction Writers of America has a reception in New York City every year, and so we had actually met there, and sparks were flying and everything. But the first time we really hung out was at this Fantastic Genres Conference. So we really have to thank John Langan, or blame him, depending on your point of view, for John and I knowing each other and for Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And then hang around after the interview where John and I will be talking about scary, scary stuff.
All right, let's get John Langan on the phone.
Hello.
Hi, it's Dave and John from Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
And it's John Langan here.
Okay, so first of all, who are some of the authors you read when you were younger who made you want to be a writer yourself, and what sort of early writing did you do before breaking into print?
I read a lot of comic books when I was a kid. I've been rereading Doctor Strange lately, the Marvel, what do they call it, Essential or whatever, these big sort of black and white, paperback reprints. And I've been reading a lot of them recently and realizing that if I'm going to talk about influences on my work, in some ways I have to talk about those guys first. When I was a kid, Marv Wolfman was doing a lot of work in Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four, and I was reading those. And then I was going back and I was reading Stan Lee's original Fantastic Four and Spider-Man. I was reading Roy Thomas writing Conan the Barbarian, and those led me into some of my, print reading, fiction reading. I read, the Conan the Barbarian. Actually, it was the series that Lynn Carter and L. Sprague de Camp had sort of cobbled together out of Robert E. Howard's original stories and then their own editions. I read almost all of those, I think, in fifth grade math class, literally behind the cover, with the book raised, the math book raised, and Conan behind the cover. So all of those I really see as lying in my background and being really important to me, to who I eventually became as a writer. Having said all that, it really wasn't until I was a freshman in high school and I read Stephen King, I read Christine, and I felt as if I'd been discovered. It's a sort of strange feeling. I read that book and thought, man, this is it. This book has almost, sort of picked me out and told me this is what you have to do. You have to do this kind of thing. As far as early writing goes, I can go all the way back to first grade. A short illustrated story I did of King Kong versus Godzilla, talk about fan fiction. But it was really done so that I could just draw the picture of King Kong and Godzilla. It really wasn't until I was in high school, and when I read King, one of the first things that made me want to do was do this stuff myself. And I won the Our Lady of Lourdes High School Christmas Writing Contest when I was 14, my freshman year in high school, for a story about a Christmas story about a little kid whose toys come to life and kill his father. My dad was really bugged out by that story. I could never understand why. I got a check for $12.50, and I got printed in the school newspaper, and probably in some ways I was lost right then, lost for serious literature. But that was I printed some stuff. I published some stuff when I was in college, and sort of the local the school literary journal. But it really wasn't until I was in my late 20s that I came back to writing horror fiction. I had been writing all throughout my 20s. I'd written a very long novel, a short novel, a bunch of novellas, I guess more or less realist works, and they just hadn't gone anywhere. I'd written some much shorter things that I'd sent out to various literary journals. They hadn't gone anywhere. And then when I got together with my wife, I really... I don't know, I guess it sounds terrible to say I got together with my wife and I started writing horror stories, but she really helped me to that horror fiction could be a legitimate venue for serious expression. She was doing her dissertation in Jack Kerouac, and we would have these conversations, and she would say, well, Kerouac believed that American popular culture is a suitable container for all kinds of serious expression, and that just did it. That just opened things up. It just kind of, I don't know, liberated me, gave me permission to go back to what I had loved as a kid, but bring to it now all this stuff that I'd learned, the decade before, working on these other novels and stories and such. And in turn, I guess, also to kind of go back to writers like Straub and Samuel Delany, whose work has also been very important to me, and to sort of look at their example and say, look at what these guys have done in these generic forms, and maybe someone else could do that too.
What works of fiction have scared you the most throughout your life?
When I was a kid, I can remember being very vividly scared by a Robert E. Howard story. I want to say it's called The Thing from the Mound. I may be wrong about that. It was in an anthology called Wolf's Head and Other Stories, which I really need to find a copy of one of these days, because I just remember being blown away by that anthology. It was no Conan stories. It was just other kinds of Howard stories. And The Thing from the Mound was about a guy who is treasure hunting in the sort of Texas wilds, and basically unleashes this vampire, who's been buried, not alive, but undead in this mound. And that I remember that story just absolutely terrifying me.
I just read, there's the horror stories of Robert E. Howard. I just read that, and so I just read that Beneath the Mound story, whatever the title is, and I really love that story. And you think you know where it's going throughout the entire story, step by step, and then at the very end, it just it's a complete surprise what happens at the end. At least it was to me.
Yeah, I kind of, Howard is one of those writers. I read him when I was a kid. As I said, I read a lot of mostly Conan stuff, I guess, but some other stuff here and there. And he's one of those writers that I suppose as you get older, you kind of feel as if you should outgrow, I guess. And he certainly has his limitations, but there's a lot about him that I find of kind of enduring fascination, and even if whatever, not all of his style is particularly felicitous or whatever, or his attitudes towards all manner of subjects are particularly progressive, still there is a kind of raw power to what he's doing. I think I was talking to Jack Haringa and Michael Morano about this at Boscone. I think it was Michael who said that Howard believes everything he writes. And I think he's probably right. I think he's probably right that the good or bad, right or wrong, Howard is invested in what he's writing. And I think that comes across in a way that, it doesn't always for a lot of his sort of lesser imitators.
So you're an English professor. What got you started on that career path, and how has being a professor affected your writing?
I came back to graduate school in my mid-20s after I'd kind of been out in the world for a few years, and my dad had died. I had moved back in to help my mom and my younger sister, and I wanted to, I don't know, reconnect, I guess, with academia, and I sat in on a class, a spring class in Hemingway and Faulkner, and really loved it. And the woman who was the chair of the English department at SUNY New Paltz, where I am now, basically offered me a teaching assistantship, and I guess, really, to be fair, really guaranteed me a teaching assistantship for the following fall if I would apply to the program. So I did, and I don't know. I just sort of wound up. I kind of fell into it. I always knew. It sounds weird to say, but I always knew that I would be a decent teacher, and when I got up in front of the classroom, yeah, I was. So it's been. In some ways, it's been a little bit of a balancing act, I guess, as you can imagine. You know, you want to bring your students something. You have to bring something to your classes. You can't save everything for yourself and your writing and what have you. So it can feel a little bit like you're splitting yourself between the work that you're doing for your writing, the concentration, the resources you need to muster to do that, and the resources that you need to muster to go into the classroom and talk about the Keats's Ode on a Grecian urn or something like that. But the good thing about it, I guess the two good things about it, one is that it keeps me in touch with a lot of great writing. And I think that's always important for you as a writer. What does the computer guy say? Garbage in, garbage out. So I think you want to stay in touch with good writing as much as you can. And so, yeah, having to go back and reread. Lately, the past few years, I've been teaching Doris Lessing's 2 Room 19 a lot. And having to go back and read and reread that has been very useful for me. I go back to Flannery O'Connor on a regular basis. I go back to Henry James on a regular basis. So that's all really good. And at the same time, they've been pretty flexible here in terms of letting me make up new classes. So I've been able to teach classes, summer classes in the Gothic. And so that's allowed me to explore some of my own interests a little bit more. And that's also good for the writing. You read or reread Frankenstein and think, oh, wow, look at that. There's you could do stuff with this.
Well, I mean, you had at least one story called Tutorial, which seems pretty obviously affected by your career in academia.
Oh, yes, Tutorial. A story that editors everywhere hate, but that young writers really seem to love. Yeah, when I was an undergraduate at New Paltz, I was really interested in creative writing as a possible major. I was an English major at the time, and the guy who did creative writing had no interest in work that was anything other than a particular kind of really naturalism. The sort of the story about the young college student disenchanted with the world. And I had a friend at the time who was taking a class with this guy, and she was interested in the same kind of stuff I was. We were both reading Clive Barker, and everything she tried to write, this guy just slammed. And the creative writing program at New Paltz has never been big, but it was especially small then. And for me, it was really frustrating. I really wanted to do all this weird stuff, and I couldn't do it. So I think that informed that story to some measure. But to be honest, the story was also informed, I guess, later on or in the years that passed after that by a number of different occurrences. I had sent Mr. Gaunt, which would become my second story in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. I had sent it to another publication first, and they rejected it and told me that my writing was murky and I needed to read Strunk and White and Elements of Style. And oh boy, was I angry. And my wife was the one who suggested, well, maybe you could write a story with a kind of, instead of the Necronomicon, it's Strunk and White, and the story sort of grew from there.
So now that you're a teacher, do you ever feel guilty about reading comic books in math class?
No, absolutely not.
Do you have any kids reading math books in your class when they're supposed to be reading?
It would serve me right. No, they're all texting each other now in my classes. No, one thing I realized a few years ago, which in retrospect seems quite obvious to me, but I honestly, it occurred to me with the force of revelation, was that I'd spent most of my young life, as I thought it, sort of goofing off from school. I read a lot of comic books. I drew a lot. I desperately wanted to be a comic artist when I was in grade school. I would trace the covers or pages of different comic books. One of my most treasured possessions was how to draw comics the Marvel way. And I would just draw, obsessively and read these things obsessively. And then when I got to high school, in part, I guess, because I went to a Catholic high school that had no art program, but also because of discovering Stephen King, it transferred. I still read comic books, but I would read a lot of horror stories, a lot of horror novels. If Stephen King said this is worth reading, I would go and read it, which is part of the reason that I came to appreciate Flannery O'Connor. But I guess because I wasn't the valedictorian or even salutatorian, I always thought of myself as, well, you weren't really much of a student. And yet it was a couple of years ago I realized, no, my God, you were an incredible student. It was just that you were a student of first drawing and then this, narrative. You were just doing it outside of, that kind of study is not what you do in grade school. It's not what you do in high school. You're supposed to be much, that kind of studying is supposed to be much more well-rounded, and that, I guess from an early age, I kind of knew what I wanted to do and pursued it in this single-minded kind of way.
Are you aware of any comics that have actually made it into the realm of academia as literature that are being taught in classes, or are there any professors who are teaching, like, comics as literature?
Yeah, we have a graphic novel class here at New Paltz. A lot of the comics, I will say, to speak more generally, a lot of the comics that have made it into academia are things like Harvey P. Carr or something, things that or what was something like Ghost World from a few years ago. I can't remember the name of the guy who did that, but comics that announce themselves as different from sort of usual superhero fare or something like that. Or Mouse, I guess. That's the big one, Spiegelman's Mouse. There's actually an excerpt from Mouse, I think, in the Norton Anthology of American Literature, Volume 2, I think. So things like those kinds of things that sort of announce themselves as being important and dealing with important subjects, those have been well received for quite a few years now. And something like Mouse has made the sort of furthest inroads into academia. But I think even now, in a class, so like the graphic novel class we have here, I think all of those texts that I just mentioned would be taught. I think they also do teach The Watchmen as well, and I think Watchmen is probably one of the few what I would think of as a real comic book, I guess. Superheroes. It's one of the few things that there's sort of wide distribution of. I have the impression that V for Vendetta may have made it as well, not in our school, but I have the impression that a lot of Alan Moore's stuff and also Neil Gaiman's stuff, it's kind of like what happens with science fiction or any genre, I guess, where someone like Philip K. Dick makes it really big and everybody reads Philip K. Dick and he makes it into the universities. I think the same things kind of happened with, say, like Alan Moore or Neil Gaiman, that there's a lot of Neil Gaiman, say in particular, his name has had a lot of penetration into academia, and lots of people in my department who've never read Neil Gaiman know who he is because they know that he did work, say, on the Beowulf movie, and that registers for them because they teach Beowulf.
So you started out publishing short stories. Could you tell us about a few of the stories that were major milestones for you, and how did you make the transition to writing a novel?
The first story that I published was called On Skua Island. And I actually wrote it for a class. I was taking doctoral courses at the City University of New York, and one of the classes I took was had a creative option for the final project, and On Skua Island was the story that came out of that. And when I was done with it, it was 11 or 12,000 words long, and there was just I thought I would try to publish it, but there was no place, none of the little magazines I was looking at would take a 12,000-word, novelette. And the only place that would was the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. And I was really intimidated about, I hadn't read F&SF since I was a kid, but still it had enough of a reputation, a new Stephen King, say, had published in it. I was really a bit intimidated by it, and much more inclined to start at the bottom, to try to find some little magazine that would publish my ridiculously long story. But again, my wife, I guess, helped me out here. She had gotten her PhD at Penn State, and her professors had told her for publishing academic articles, you always start at the top. You always start at the top, and then you work your way down. And so she said, start at the top. So I sent the story in to FNSF, fully expecting a rejection letter. And much to my surprise, a check showed up. I can still remember being in my bathrobe at the end of the driveway, opening the mailbox, and here was this envelope from FNSF, and I was, not the envelope I had sent them to return my story. And I can still remember splitting it open, and here was this check, and I was just out of my mind. Very quickly after it had been accepted, I wrote the first draft of my second, what would be my second story, Mr. Gaunt, which, as I said, was rejected by another magazine pretty quickly. So that helped to keep my ego in check, I suppose. And that story did require a bit more revision. But there was sort of, I wrote basically 3 stories on School Island, Mr. Gaunt and Tutorial, relatively soon, one after the other. They appeared each one sort of over the course of 3 years. And then I came to write my first novel basically because I was looking. My wife was pregnant with our son, and I was looking to write one more story and send that into Gordon's, so it would kind of, because it usually I was sort of a lag time of about a year between the time that I sent him a story and the time he published it. And I was looking to have a sort of a story in reserve with him, I guess, for my son being born, because I knew that I wouldn't get much writing done. But that story turned into a novel, which it just kind of kept going. It just, there was more of it that wanted to be told. And to be quite honest, I stopped that to write what actually did become my first novel. So what I thought was going to be my first novel, I put aside to write what I thought was going to be another short story. And then that story just grew and grew, and that became what's since been published as my first novel, House of Windows.
So what's so scary about A House of Windows? To me, it sounds very pleasant and sunny. You
have to dress in the basement, of course, for one thing. But all those kids with their stones. In the novel, the house, there's the suggestion that the house has the capacity to bring to light, to manifest, I guess, what's worst within us, and whether the novel leaves open the question of whether the house itself, whether there's just something wrong with the house itself, or whether there's some kind of malevolent entity that's attached itself to the house, sort of haunting the house or possessing the house or something like that. But the house is, in a way, the house is a mirror. It's a window that you can see yourself in, with all your flaws, and all those that mirror brings all those flaws to life.
So in House of Windows and On School Island, they have a very similar structure to them. They're both about a group of people at a house telling scary stories. What draws you to that type of storytelling, where the actual storytelling is integral to the piece?
Well, when I wrote On School Island, that was in part. It was part of a class that was. It was written as a final assignment for a class that was about kind of postmodern takes on Victorian literature. And so that, I suppose, the structure of On School Island, having a bunch of people sitting around telling a story, and then we get the story they tell, or that one of them tells, is the principal material of the story. That was really indebted, I guess, to certain earlier narratives, like, say, Henry James, The Turn of the Screw is one of the big ones. But I've read a lot of Joseph Conrad in my life, and that's a structure that Conrad likes as well, obviously in something like Heart of Darkness. So it was very much a form that had a kind of a rich tradition associated with it, and it seemed quite fun to play with and to exploit, especially since I could have my people in the beginning of the story on School Island talking about horror stories, so you could have this nice meta kind of thing going on. When I started House of Windows, I actually intended that to be sort of a sequel to On School Island, in that I thought, okay, I'll write another story where it's the same group of people, or more or less the same group of people. They're back at this house, and here's someone who has another scary story. And I actually imagined that ultimately I could have a sort of a series of these stories, collect them in a book, and it would be something that I could just return to every so often. Oh, here we are back at this house. I may have had not to claim more illustrious precedents than I actually have, but I may have had Isaac Bashevis Singer in mind, and in a number of his stories, he'll write from the point of view of a narrator who seems to be ostensibly Singer himself, and he gets a knock on his door, and he opens the door, and there's an old man or an old woman or whatever standing outside the door who says, "Are you Singer the writer?" And he says, "Yes, I am." And they say, "Oh, have I got a story for you?" And they come in and they tell him this story.
I mean, certainly when I was a student, if I had had a professor like you who was actually knowledgeable about horror and could teach me things like that, I would have been ecstatic. I mean, do you see any of that from your students where they're like, oh wow, a cool young professor who is interested in this stuff too?
No, sadly, they all hate me. I'm forever railing about, ratemyprofessor.com, because I don't get any hot chili peppers. If there's other people in the English department get their hot chili peppers, and I'm like, where's my hot chili pepper? And my wife just pats my head. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I think when it comes to teaching, especially teaching creative writing, I feel very much I want to give to my creative writing students the kind of opportunity I didn't have as an undergraduate, which is to explore this stuff if that's what they're interested in. So if they want to write science fiction, fantasy, horror, mystery fiction, anything that we recognize, we sort of throw under that great big label of genre, I want to give them the opportunity to work in that. At the same time, I don't want to just turn the tables and say, you can't write your story about your pathetic life as an undergraduate. No, if you want to write, if you want to work in a realist tradition, whatever, Raymond Carver, Tobias Wolff, something like that, you should be able to do that too.
So you've expressed an admiration for the writings of Henry James. What about him appeals to you, and how has that affected your writing?
Well, I think with James, I hated James. I have to make it clear. When I read James I had to read him as a senior in high school. I had to read The Turn of the Screw. You would think if any story would be good for a young horror writer, it would be The Turn of the Screw. Oh, and I hated him with a passion. I just I thought, oh my God, why can't you just get to the point? And I wasn't ready for him. And that's fun. It wasn't the first time I read Dickens. It was the same thing. I read Dickens when I was a sophomore. No, actually, I was a junior. I read Great Expectations, and I hated it. And it was only, in the case of Dickens, like 10 years later that I read him, and I was like, wow, this guy's great. In the case of James, it took a couple more years till I was in college, and I read his very late ghost story, The Jolly Corner, and it just blew me away. It's about a man who's being haunted by the ghost of the man he could have been. And it always amazes me in retrospect that should have been the story of James that worked for me, because it was it's a very hard story to read. It's very densely written, but for whatever reason I was just in the right headspace to get it, and I just thought, this guy's a genius. I've got to completely change my mind about this guy. I've got to reread him. I think what's fascinated me as I continue to come back to James is that so much of James's stuff is pure melodrama. It's if you dig just a little bit under that glittering prose, you've got these stories that are the things of Gothic melodrama, and yet he's covering it over with all this fine prose.
Have you gotten any feedback from readers that was interesting on anything that you've written?
When I published my story tutorial, there's a detail in there about a tiny little sword. It's like a letter opener that the evil sort of supernatural figure has, that he can stab the student's paper with, and it stabs the student, makes the student hurt. And I had one woman send me an email saying, where can I get one of those? Obviously it was meant humorously, but it still creeped me out.
Great. So what are you working on now, and what do you have coming up?
Well, I've just had a short story, actually a novelette, I guess, called City of the Dog, that appeared in the January-February issue of FNSF. It was also released for that time period on Sue Voodoo. And in April, I think it is, I have a story called The Shallows, which will be appearing in an anthology called Cthulhu's Reign, which has been edited by Daryl Schweitzer, and which is an anthology predicated on the idea that Cthulhu has won. The old ones have come back. The earth is now under the sway of all these Lovecraftian monsters. What happens next? I have a couple of stories out right now. I don't know what's going to happen with them, but hopefully they'll be accepted. And then a lot on the horizon. I'm trying to finish 4 different stories for 4 different anthologies. My second novel, I'm trying to put together the. I've got about 60% of the novel done. I'm at the point of trying to put together a synopsis of the rest so that my agent can shop it around, and along with that, my second story collection. And I've got a couple of other novel projects I'm trying to come up with outlines for. So it's busy. It's busy, but I'm not complaining. I might give a shout out, I guess, to a couple of novels and I guess a couple of novels published recently if people are looking for other good things to read. And I do think that Sarah Langan's new novel, Audrey's Door, she's no relation, but I think she's a brilliant writer, and I think she just goes from strength to strength. And I would also throw out Sarah Waters' novel, The Little Stranger, which, of course, got lots of favorable attention from Stephen King and Entertainment Weekly.
Well, wow, you can't do much better than Stephen King in Entertainment Weekly and being mentioned on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
It sort of covers from A to Z,
All right, well, John Langan, author of House of Windows, thanks so much for joining us on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
And thank you very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
And that was our interview. So thanks so much to John Langan for joining us on the show. So I hope that interview gave you a sense of how funny John Langan is and how much fun he is to hang out with. And I was thinking actually that a lot of people, I think, probably have this stereotype of horror writers as kind of like disturbed, creepy loners, sort of. And it was funny, when I first kind of started meeting other writers and things, somebody told me that actually most horror writers are really well adjusted, and that actually that most horror writers have the kind of personality that you would expect a comedian to have, and that most comedians have the kind of personality that you would expect a horror writer to have. That the horror writers all seem to be jolly, and the comedians all seem to be morose. And obviously, nothing like that is universally true, but it's certainly been true to a surprising extent among the people that I've met.
I've heard the same thing, and I've certainly witnessed the fact that most horror writers do seem to be jolly, as you say. I don't know that I've met one that actually is the sort of brooding, morose figure that you expect them to be based on what they write. But it kind of makes sense to me. Just that. If you have these sort of dark thoughts and stuff in your head, the horror writers get them all out on the page, and maybe that just sort of cleanses their mind from having to deal with it or think about it. Whereas for a comedian, I guess kind of the opposite happens. It's like you put all the mirth and good times into your comedy, and then so you're left with just the bad stuff in your head.
Mm-hmm. And probably if you're a comedian, everyone you meet is like, "Hey, tell me a joke," and that gets to be really depressing after a while. It also seems to me like if you're a comedian, that most good comedy comes out of being able to see through people's illusions, see through BS. Mm-hmm. And it seems like a lot of people, what gets them through the day is BS. And so if you can see through all of that, I guess it can be pretty discouraging. Like I've heard that Douglas Adams, which is one of the funniest science fiction writers, kind of struggled with depression himself. But then, like with horror writers, another thing also might just be that if you spend all day thinking about the worst things that could happen to people, that your own life doesn't seem so bad by comparison. You're like, well, nobody hung me up on a meat hook today, so I guess this must have been a good day. But there is, it seems like kind of this connection between horror and humor, because horror and humor are two genres where you're trying to evoke an involuntary response, a sort of physical involuntary response, either laughter or sort of visceral fear. And a lot of times when people are scared, they'll laugh because they just, they have to do something to release the tension. And a lot of times horror, when it fails, evokes laughter, right? There's really nothing funnier than a really bad horror movie, right? You just sit around with your friends and all just laugh at it. Mm-hmm. So I think that might be another reason why horror writers, it seems, are so well adjusted, is that they have to have a good sense of humor to do what they do. Like I don't write a ton of horror, but I certainly write some, and a lot of my stuff, even if it's not horror, has kind of a darkness to it. And people will ask me, so I get asked a lot. People will say, why would you write a story about chainsawing a busload of nuns? and I'll say, because it's funny. But I do think, that most horror writers, they're they sort of cackle with glee as they're working. And I heard Stephen King interviewed, and they asked him, how do you know when you have an idea for a story? How do you know whether it's a good idea or not? And he says, well, if it makes me laugh, then it's a good idea.
Well, maybe you should try writing some more horror yourself, and then you'll suddenly seem more well-adjusted to everyone. It'll also test that hypothesis for us, so it'll be sort of a win-win.
Yeah, I was going to say, not all horror writers are sort of creepy loners. Just me. But I did want to talk in this episode about what kind of stuff has scared us the most. I mean, I asked John Langan that, and this was actually inspired. There's a website called Temple Library Reviews that Harry Markov does, and he was nice enough to interview me for his Halloween issue, and that was the question: is what scared you the most? So I had some time to think about this and write down some of my things. And I hadn't thought about this in years and years, but there was this book I read when I was a little kid called Baleful Beasts and Eerie Creatures. And the first story in that book was called The Patchwork Monkey. And that story was so scary. I mean, I actually, I looked up the book on Amazon.com, and it's just like review after review where people are just like, the Patchwork Monkey is so scary. And like, here's a typical example. Quote, I read The Patchwork Monkey when I was 7 and slept with my parents for a month. It scared me so bad that my mom had the librarian get rid of the book. And that story had that same effect on me. I guess this story was just turned into a short film. I'm too scared to watch it, but maybe if you're not scared, you should check that out. But I was kind of thinking, like, because I really avoided horror to a substantial extent for years after reading this story, because it scared me so much. And I was just thinking, like, man, how many thousands of dollars did the horror field lose from all the people who were just too scared by children's books like that? I never really read Stephen King growing up, or watched the stuff that other people my age were watching, like Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street, because I was just too scared. But even so, I would have like nightmares about Freddy Krueger just from hearing other people talk about it. In the house where I grew up, we sort of had a basement, and you could open a door into a back basement, and you could kind of open a door into a cellar. And in my nightmares, this would be kind of this endless sequence of chambers where you would just wander around. It was like this giant labyrinth, and Freddy Krueger would be chasing me through there.
It's not really scary, but I mean, the thing that sort of evoked the most feeling of horror in me is Chuck Palahniuk's story Guts. It's like one of these stories where you can actually read it online, so we'll have a link for you in the show notes. But it's one of these stories where, like, as soon as I read it, like, it was instantly, like, sort of tattooed in my brain, and I can never forget what happens in that story. And yet, even though I remember it so vividly, when I went back to reread it, I was, like, physically cringing again as I was reading it, because it's, like, just so horrifying, like, what happens in that story. And that's actually kind of a good example of what you were talking about with the sort of sense of humor and like, how, like, Stephen King could know a story or know something's a good idea because it makes him laugh. And I could just picture Chuck Palahniuk thinking how hilarious this is when he's writing this story, because I mean, it is kind of funny on the surface of it when you think about, like, sort of what's happening, because it's so crazy. But I mean, it's just so like beautifully written, the way he sort of puts it all together, and it's just, God, it's so, I don't want to say gut wrenching because because of the title's Guts, but I mean, it is. It's like it just sort of makes you feel horrible while you're reading it. Yeah, I'm sorry, do you want to...
Yeah, well, I went and saw Chuck Palahniuk give a reading when I was in LA. He came to Vroman's bookstore in Pasadena, and I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. I was just going to see any author who appeared, and so I show up, and there was just hundreds and hundreds of people. They sort of, at Vroman's, they have kind of this back patio area that's really, really nice for readings, and it was completely full. Every ledge is crammed with people. And there were all these guys wearing wedding dresses, which I guess had something to do with his novel. And so he comes out, and he was asking trivia questions. And if you answered one of the trivia questions right, he had this whole bag full of inflatable arms and legs. And so he was throwing these out into the audience. And I think, like, decapitated moose heads or something too. And but yeah, he read a story, or I guess he read a couple short pieces that were just, it was just really just difficult to listen to. They were so intense and disgusting. And I guess I heard that people were, like, fainting at his readings. That was sort of his goal. was to see how many people he could have faint at his readings.
Yeah, well, I heard specifically with Guts that that's what was happening when he was reading that story a lot, that people were passing out. The more I think about Palahniuk, I haven't actually read a whole lot of his novels. Fight Club's one of my favorite movies, but after seeing Fight Club, I actually tried. I went out and looked for a bunch of his other works, and I forget which one it was. I think it was in Choke, but there was something in there. I don't even want to repeat it because it's so horrible, and I don't want to inflict it on anyone else. But there's just this throwaway line that he's talking about like some sick twisted guy who like does something, and I'm like, oh God, I wish I never heard that, because I would have never thought about that. It's like something that you would run into in everyday life without thinking about it, and then just sort of may even be unaware of it. But if you ever knew what you had sort of blundered into, you would be so revolted and disgusted that you'd never be able to wash it off of yourself. And so I'm like, I wish I never read that, and it's terrible. And that actually kind of I actually didn't finish whatever book that was. I think it was Choke, but it kind of put me off of him a little bit. Although I do love Guts, but I got to that and I was just like, I don't know, it was a little hard to go on after that.
Well, I did want to talk about this a little bit because there's this famous quote from Stephen King where he says, quote, "I recognize terror as the finest emotion, and so I will try to terrorize the reader. But if I find that I cannot terrify, I will try to horrify. And if I find that I cannot horrify, I'll go for the gross out. I'm not proud." And so, when I first read this quote, I thought it was pretty clever. But the more I've thought about it, the more I'm, I've never been a big fan of gross out kind of stuff. And I guess that's kind of a subjective sort of thing. I'm sure a lot of the stuff I've written, other people would read it and think it was gross in that way. But we were just talking about this in terms of movies that, but when I go to a movie, I don't want to have to bring a barf bag with me into the theater. That's not why I go to the movies. And, so I want things that are going to be intense and, frightening. And I want things that are going to sort of stimulate my mind and get my heartbeat going. But, the less it can involve my stomach, I think, is generally what I prefer. Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle about the meatpacking industry, and he was hoping that people would be so horrified by the condition of the workers that they would want to reform the industry. And actually people were so disgusted by what was going into the food that that's where the motivation came. And so Sinclair said, I aimed for people's hearts and I hit their stomach. And I think a lot of horror writers, it seems like they ought to be aiming for the heart, but they're just hitting the stomach.
I think it's a fine line. I think, some element of the gross out sort of necessarily sort of seeps into horror, or maybe not necessarily, but, often seeps into horror. And it's a fine line where it becomes like too much. And like, in the case of that one Palahniuk book, it was too much for me. Whereas with Guts, it's like, it's pretty gross, but I don't think that's not the thing about the story that like makes it indelible in my memory. You know what I mean? And it's horrifying for like other reasons as well. But I think that's the problem I have with a lot of horror fiction is particularly with like the sort of splatterpunk mode of horror, which is just sort of goes for the as much over the top as they can go. And when it sort of gets that far into the, it's just sort of disgusting stuff that I kind of lose interest, because I'm more interested in the cerebral part of horror.
That was sort of my experience with the Saw movies, is that I watched Saw 1 and Saw 2, and I really thought the twists at the ending were pretty entertaining in both of them. But particularly Saw 2, it just disgusted me so much, when Saw 3 came out. I was just like, I don't want to sit through this, And I guess, I don't know how many Saw movies there are now, like 20 it seems like. But
I think there's 6.
But that's a case where they actually lost my business by just making it just too gross.
Yeah, a lot of horror fiction and on in print and on film, like it doesn't really scare me. Like, there's a huge distinction obviously between being startled by something that happens on the screen and actually being scared. Because a lot of films, They sort of have all these sort of quick cuts and stuff, and that's just sort of a trick that startles you, but that's not really frightening you. That's just like you're scared. You're kind of scared for a second, but that's not like fear.
Or just the really loud noises that make you jump and you see it, and you're just on edge because they're going to blast a loud noise at you, and that's doesn't have anything to do with the movie really anyway.
Right. And, so one movie that I saw recently, actually, that I really found very creepy and was the closest I could ever say to actually being, like, scared at a movie, is this movie Quarantine, which was based on a Spanish film called REC, which is, like, short for record. I think the reason that it was so scary is because it uses the sort of first-person viewpoint. So, like, the camera is a character in the story because it's a cameraman is, it's sort of like a reality. It's like a reality show where, some crazy stuff starts happening while they're filming it. And because the camera is a character in the movie, it kind of makes it more immediate and it makes it seem more real. Like, I can't really say that I'm ever really scared of anything that I read or watch on film. It's like reality scares me.
Well, yeah, that's like when I was a freshman in college. There were two sort of urban legends going around that probably scared me as much as anything ever has. But so the first one, there's this, college freshman, and he goes to a party and goes home with this girl, and she gives him a drink, and he drinks it and passes out. And then he wakes up in a bathtub full of ice, and one of his hands has a cell phone glued to it, and in the other hand, there's a note glued to it, and the note says, "Call 911 or you'll die." And so then he calls 911, and the paramedics come to get him. And then when he arrives at the hospital, they tell him that his kidneys have been stolen. And that was presented to me as a true story. And and that really creeped me out. The other one was this girl, a girl in college is planning to spend the night at her boyfriend's dorm room. But so before she walks over to his dorm, she wants to get a sweater, and so she goes back to her room and goes in, and her roommate is asleep, and she doesn't want to wake her roommate up, so she doesn't turn on the lights, and she just walks over to her bed and picks up her sweater off the bed and walks out again. And in the morning when she comes back, there's crowds and police and crime scene tape and stuff, and she goes into the dorm and she says, what's going on? And they're like, well, this girl was horribly murdered during the night. And it's her roommate, and she's like, that's my room, and on the door in blood is written, "Aren't you glad you didn't turn on the lights?" But I mean, speaking of like scary stuff in real life, I mean, I understand, received some death threats from writers in your editorial capacity. I mean, is that something that scared you?
There was only one actual death threat, and it didn't particularly scare me. It just kind of pissed me off because, I didn't really think that the guy was going to go through with it. This was when I was at Fantasy and Science Fiction, and obviously we had a post office box, and it wasn't the easiest thing to do to actually find out where the office address was. But I mean, I guess that could have been scary, but just like he sent one letter, and then we never heard from him again. And I actually because it pissed me off, I did call like the postal inspector, and they referred me to the FBI, and neither one of them seemed to think that there was anything to do about it, and so I figured that doesn't really matter.
Oh, but I thought you were able to figure out who it was because it was from the small town. And
I mean we did think we knew who it was because only one submission had come from the zip code where his letter came from, so we kind of figured it must have been that guy. But even with that information, the FBI would not go pay him a visit or anything. But I mean, honestly, just sort of random terrorism scares me more than something like that, because I mean, it's really easy to sort of just get pissed off at a rejection letter and write some stupid response like that.
Yeah, I mean, who hasn't written a death threat after getting a rejection letter, really?
Yeah.
But no, I mean, when I was trying to think about stuff for this show, I mean, thinking about horror, it's really impossible for me to think about horror without thinking, like, as you're saying, about just the TV news, and stuff that's just presented to you, not as horror fiction, but reality, but that it kind of is fiction in a way when you think about it. Like our friend Tobias Bakel, who's a writer, told me the story that when he was a teenager, his mom took him to visit some elderly relative or something, and this woman just seemed on edge the whole time. And when Toby, the teenager, came into a room, she would kind of hurry out and seemed to not want to be alone with him. And so Toby finally asked his mom, what's going on here? And his mom just said, oh, well, this woman, she hasn't left this house in years, and all the information she gets is the TV news, and she just imagines that all teenagers are dangerous criminals, and so she's just afraid you're going to attack her if you get half a chance.
Wow.
And so that's kind of like like what this woman's been receiving is like horror fiction, you know. But I had like another example of that. But you know, I mean, I think it's such a problem in our society, the way that advertisers prey on your fears and try to undermine your confidence and develop fears into you that they can then exploit. And I had this experience where I was watching, you know, I used to watch CNN all the time because I was interested in following the news. And on CNN, it's just the same ads over and over and over and over again. You know, like that goddamn Geico lizard. But so all the ads are, you know, most of the ads are like, you know, do you have too much credit card debt? You know, consolidate all your bills into one low monthly payment. And it got to the point where I would literally like wake up in the middle of the night worried about my credit card bills. And I didn't even have any credit card bills. But, you know, the message was just so relentless. And so I just wonder, you know, because people spend so much time watching TV. I mean, doesn't the average American spend like 4 or 6 hours a day watching TV or something? I mean, can you imagine if everybody had a friend, like their best friend with whom they spent 4 to 6 hours a day, who was consciously trying to make them afraid in order to exploit their fears for money? Right. What would the societal impact of that be? But that's basically what the situation actually is right now. Right.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned that happening on CNN because I'm not that I watch the Glenn Beck show, but you know, I watch the Daily Show, and they sort of have pointed this out. But on Glenn Beck's show, I guess he has several advertisers that are basically, you know, saying, you know, well, you guys all know the apocalypse is coming, so you know we can help out with that. And it's like there's one that was sort of advertising some sort of seed kit, you know, for in the event of the apocalypse, you have these seeds that you can sort of, you know, grow some crops after you know the world ends, and then also like, you know, there's and Beck himself has been sort of recruited as a pitchman for gold, because, you know, like when I guess in times of war or whatever, gold will rise in value, and it will be the only thing, you know, worth anything after the whole civilization collapses, because, you know, paper money won't be worth anything, and the stock market certainly won't be worth anything. But if you have gold, that'll be great.
And I mean, but like, you know, it seems like the news has been so much scarier for the past 10 years or so than it was at any point that I can remember. But what impact do you think that has on horror fiction? I mean, you sort of talked about, right, when you were editing FNSF, that right after September 11th, you got just a flood of like more downbeat kind of stories.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think it certainly feeds into everyone's anxieties. You know, I mean, specifically after 9/11, there was a lot of post-apocalyptic fiction, and the stuff that you would see on the news was certainly going to feed into that. You know, with all the, you know, sort of these threats of terrorism that, you know, the government is investigating and all this kind of stuff. It's like, you know, if they didn't keep mentioning it on the news, it would probably sort of slip into the back of your mind, and it wouldn't be weighing on you. But with the constant reminder of it in the newspapers and on the TV news, it's like you can't escape it. And so I think a lot of writers were just sort of channeling that into fiction, which, you know, like as we were saying before, horror writers do maybe typically do that, and that's why they can sort of have a jolly disposition.
Well, but so I mean, it seems like maybe scary times make writers want to write scary stuff and express that. But does it make readers want to read scary stuff, or do you think? Because I've heard like during the Depression and stuff, everybody wanted to watch comedy movies because they wanted an escape from the scariness. I mean, how do you think that readers react to scary times?
I don't know. I think readers want to read more about it too. I mean, and, you know, I mean, I can certainly say from my own experience that, like, my anthologies like Wastelands and The Living Dead, I mean, you know, they're both very popular, and, you know, it seems like that's probably not a coincidence that, you know, that people are interested in this topic, even though they're sort of downbeat and scary ideas in those books.
Well, I mean, speaking of like the government and terrorism and stuff, I mean, one phenomenon we've had for the past years is this color-coded terrorist warning system. And, you know, Tom Ridge, the former head of Homeland Security, wrote a book recently where he sort of came out and said, you know, it always seemed to me when I was issuing these things that it had more to do with politics than any actual information we had. And everyone's kind of like, yeah, Tom, we know, it's okay. But I mean, it really did seem like the government was intentionally using this chart to stoke people's fears. You know, like whenever the president's poll numbers were going down, or whenever there was a big scandal or something, the terrorist warning would suddenly go up again. And it actually kind of occurred to me that I actually would kind of regard the color-coded terrorist warning chart as maybe like the greatest piece of horror fiction of the last 10 years in terms of, scaring the most people, in terms of, being fiction completely made up and scaring the most number of people. But I think there's a lot of lessons for horror writers in that. And one of them is that if your goal is to scare the most number of people, you might think that you would turn the warning all the way up to the highest point and just leave it there, right? And you're like, that'll scare people the most. You have to be as afraid as possible. But actually that doesn't work, because then there's no change, right? Whereas it's a lot more effective to raise the level and scare people and then bring it down again and wait a while and people sort of let their guard down. And then it's a news story when it goes back up again, and just keep doing that. And it seems to me like a lot of writers, they just try to put in as much scary, just sort of like cram as much scary stuff in as possible, or exciting stuff, or funny stuff, whatever it is, without having those kind of peaks and troughs that give the audience a break, give them time to kind of let their guard down, so to speak. Even in comedy too, a student in the program I was in had gone to see the guy who wrote Little Miss Sunshine, and his philosophy was that what's wrong with most comedies is that they try to make every scene as funny as possible. And so usually like the first 4 or 5 scenes in a movie are really, really funny. And then after a while, you just get less and less entertained, because, when every scene's full of hilarious things, it just becomes exhausting. And his philosophy was to make the beginning of the movie more or less serious, have the first half of the movie be serious, and have slightly funnier and funnier things happen, and then have the funniest thing happen at the end. And I thought that was really interesting. And sort of, I would say Michael Bay movies are kind of the same thing with action, where you're trying to turn it up to red for every single scene, and it just pummels you. It just becomes too much. So I think that's one lesson from the terrorist alerts. And then the other is what we call in the trade hand waving. And this is not something I would ever do myself, but I've heard other writers maybe would do this, is if you have something in your story, say you have point A and point C that are both really good, and the only way to get between them is to go through point B, and point B doesn't really make a lot of sense. And so you would have something really big happen around that same time, so that people are too distracted to pay attention to the maybe the little plot hole or something that you want people to be distracted from. And so we call this hand waving, because stage magicians will wave their hands around so that you're watching their hands and not what else is going on stage. So it's kind of like the same thing with the color chart, is that you don't just do it randomly. You just wait until you have a big scandal that you want people not to be paying attention to, and then you raise it.
I was just thinking about another thing that sort of really scared me from when I was a kid. Did you ever see a movie called Dreamscape?
No.
I don't think it was specifically supposed to be horror, but it was a science fiction movie. But it introduced a concept to me that had never occurred to me before. But the idea, I don't know if this is actually, has any basis in reality, but in the movie, the idea was that if you died in your dream, you would actually die in real life. And that just freaked me out so much. I would actually lay up in bed sometimes, scared, how am I going to navigate this dreamscape and not die? I mean, that always freaked me out. Did you ever come across that concept before?
Oh, sure. I mean, when I was a kid, people used to say all the time that if you actually died in your, that you would always wake up. Mm-hmm. But if you weren't to wake up and you died in your dream, you would die in real life.
So I mean, what other kind of concepts or whatever do you find scary? I mean, in addition to something like.
Well, I have a list.
Okay.
Right. Well, like monkeys.
What, really?
Yeah, man. That. I told you that patchwork monkey, man. I was just completely scarred by that. And then Stephen King had his story of the monkey. That creeped me out too. I mean, there's something just creepy to me about monkeys, because they're kind of like people except wrong. And then clowns, of course. Dolls.
Well, I mean, are
puppets.
You making a distinction between creepy and actually these are things that scare you?
These are no, seriously, one of the scariest movies I ever saw was called Killer Klowns from Outer Space. Mm-hmm. Have you ever seen this?
I can't remember if I've actually seen it. I mean, I'm aware of it.
I mean, I don't know if I watched it now. I don't know. I mean, I think it's supposed to be funny, because there's these killer clowns from outer space, and they cocoon people in cotton candy and then suck their blood out with curly straws. Mm-hmm. And the only way to kill them is to shoot them in their big red noses, which then explode. And so when I think about all that, it seems really funny. But that movie just creeped me out. And it's just because clowns are just so freaking creepy. I can't, why would you ever expose a little kid to a clown, And like there's this this great Michael Chabon story called The God of Dark Laughter. It's a Lovecraft pastiche, and the premise is that there's kind of a secret race of clown-like people, and they hide among circuses because then they just look like they look like all the other clowns, and they don't stand out. And there's this cult that is trying to kill them all, and this cult believes that when the last of these clown people is killed, the world will end, or like a Cthulhu type god will come to Earth and the world will end. And I think there's a monkey in it, if I'm remembering correctly. But it's just, I really, really enjoyed that story, and he published it in the New Yorker. And I just love that Michael Chabon could get a Lovecraft pastiche about a clown murdering cult published in the New Yorker.
Like, one of the other things that actually like really freaks me out is bugs, like in real life. It kind of extended to the video game Fallout 3. It's like a first person shooter, and so although it's a role playing game, but the engine is a first person shooter engine, and so like as you're walking around this desolate landscape, stuff can scare you, but it's usually just like startles you. But there's like these gigantic cockroaches in there. They called rad roaches or something, and they make this skittering noise, and it's, oh my god, it would drive me crazy. It's just like freaking me out the whole time. Like I'm walking through some abandoned building, and it's like it's full of these rad roaches, and they're just skittering and skittering and skittering, and I can't see where they are because it's dark, and they're they sort of blend in, and oh man.
And that of course reminds me of George R. R. Martin's story Sand Kings. Which is one of the creepiest stories I've read. And actually, I was in an airport, and our flight was delayed for hours and hours. And so I went to the bookstore and bought a book of Hugo Award-winning short stories, and that's where I first read Sand Kings. And it creeped me out so much. I mean, my skin was all tingling, and that's just like the least likely place you're going to be scared is in an airport surrounded by hundreds of people in the middle of the afternoon when you're bored and waiting for your flight. And the fact that story was able to just creep me out so much in that situation, I think, is really just a testament to just how effective it is.
It's funny how that's a science fiction story, so that gets me thinking about sort of some of the ways you can find like just the most horrifying things in like sort of out of the typical horror context. Like for instance, Greg Egan has this story called Learning to Be Me, and it's in this future where everybody is implanted with this thing they call like a gem or something, but it's basically like a computer backup for your personality, for the essence of you, so that like you would be able to live on beyond your body. And everybody in this world would switch over from their biological brain to the gem brain at some point in their lives. And this was something that the narrator was very concerned about, because he was thinking, as I think is completely warranted, will I actually die and a copy of me will just be living on, or will I actually live on after this? And the way the story is constructed just does such a perfect job of conveying that sense of dread that he would have, or at least that I feel I would have, in trying to make that decision to switch over to this, sort of this computer backup of your brain. Just because like that, I mean, that's like a concept that I've seen in science fiction before, and I just never have bought it. And, it's like it's fun to play with the concept sometimes because you can tell interesting stories using it, but I just never believed that it could be used as like a way to get to immortality. And this was the first story that I remembered seeing that actually explored it in this sort of horrific way.
Well, I mean, we've been talking about, the difference between horror and fiction and horror in real life, but it really seems to me that for a lot of people, there's not such a big distinction between fiction and real life. Mm-hmm. And like there was this guy I met in LA, and he was a self-described fundamentalist. And so he said to me, I have this argument for why my beliefs are true that you absolutely will not be able to refute. And I was like, okay, yeah, sure. What is it? Now I'm expecting him to talk about Thomas Aquinas or irreducible complexity or the anthropic principle or something like that. And he's like, okay, so there's this guy I know, and he can perform exorcisms. And so he says to me, go to the store and get some eggs, make sure that there's nothing, they're just normal eggs. And so I went to the store and I just got these normal eggs, and yeah, they were just normal eggs. And so he took me to this house where this woman was possessed by a demon, and I gave him one of the eggs, and he like sucked the demon out of her body and put it in the egg. And then he broke the egg open, and it was like full of like black goo. And he's like, so what do you say to that? He's like, how can you not believe in the supernatural after you've seen something like that? And so, I mean, it just seems to me, like, thinking about this guy, I'm like, this guy is disconnected from reality on 3 different levels that I can identify, right? Like, A, he thinks that there are demons. B, he thinks that you can take demons and put them in an egg. And 3, he thinks he can tell me this story and I'm not just going to laugh at him. Right? It seems like these are all just disconnections from reality. But I mean, yeah, I mean, it does. So I'm thinking about this guy and I'm like, wow, you know, like I can go to a supernatural horror movie and be scared and be excited. And then the movie's over and I walk back outside of the theater and I'm not in a supernatural horror movie anymore. But this guy, like, for him, the movie never ends. You know, the whole world is like a supernatural horror movie and he's surrounded by demons and stuff. And I was kind of thinking, like, it would be kind of, I mean, because I like supernatural horror, it would be kind of cool. It's almost like his life is like a live action role playing game, right? Where you're so deep in your character, you don't even realize that it's a role playing game. And so I was thinking it would be kind of cool if you could take a drug or something where it would give you that guy's worldview for 24 hours or something. You could just walk around like having crazy thoughts that don't make any sense. And then you would return to reality. And you could tell your friends, like, oh my God, you know, dude, you won't believe all the crazy stuff I believed. I thought that you could like take demons and put them in eggs. And your friends are all like, no way. You're like, no, dude, I totally believe that.
So it sounds like you're a real believer in better living through chemistry. You brought this up on the show before, how you wish there was a drug that would do something or other. I don't remember what it was, but...
Well, you know, I grew up reading Philip K. Dick books.
Yeah,
so
yeah. I guess it's
I'm
inevitable.
I'm all about the drugs causing, creating science fictional conceits.
So what I want to know is, what did you say to the guy? Because he said, well, what do you say to that?
Well, I said, I mean, I'm quite convinced that this guy was pulling your leg, or hoaxing you, which happens so much. I mean, just because of like through people I know and things, I just hear about hoaxes like this being exposed day after day after day after day. And like with a guy like that, you kind of don't know. I mean, the hoaxer, I mean, or maybe the guy actually can perform exorcisms and put demons into eggs. I mean, I would love to see that experiment performed under laboratory conditions, but it seems like in these cases that there are kind of 2 scenarios where, A, there's just kind of con artists who just, want to do tricks and fool people and they get a thrill out of it, and maybe they want to like bilk money out of people and stuff. But the other one I think is a lot more interesting is what people call pious fraud, where it's sort of like what leads people to streak oil under the eyes of religious statues to make it look like they're weeping, to make it look like it's a miracle. But what motivates people in those cases is often they want more people coming to their church, and they're upset that more people aren't coming to their church. And they think if there's a miracle, more people will come to the church. And so they decide to do it themselves. But rather than thinking of it as a fraud, they think of it as, well, I'm doing the right thing and God approves. And in a way, God is acting through me to do this. So in a way, it actually kind of is a miracle, right? And so I think a large proportion of those things, the person is kind of acting out of misguided but well-intentioned motives. So yeah, just when John Langan was talking about how he sent this story to this magazine and they told him that he had to read Strunk and White, I just wanted to talk about that because, all the whole time I was growing up, everyone was like, Strunk and White, you have to read Strunk and White. And I would read it, and I'm like, this is all right. Some of this stuff I don't agree with. I would actually be curious to go back, and I haven't looked at it for a long time, what I make of it now. But somebody just recently linked to this article I thought was really, really interesting about Strunk and White. And this is a viewpoint I had never heard expressed before. But this is an article by Jeffrey K. Pullum on the Chronicle of Higher Education, and the article is called 50 Years of Stupid Grammar Advice. And he really slams Strunk and White. He basically argues that they don't really know anything about grammar, and that all their grammar advice is wrong, and that they don't even follow their own grammar advice in their own book, and that a lot of these rules are just completely arbitrary, and they don't conform to the usage of English throughout history, by all the greatest writers. So I definitely recommend people check that out and get an alternate viewpoint.
Yeah, I mean, grammar was always something I just kind of felt like you have to learn to navigate it by feel. You have to just read a lot of books and sort of absorb the way English sentences are constructed by doing that, And then once you sort of have this innate feel for it, then you can sort of, maybe check a reference book like Elements of Style to see if there's anything that you can sort of tweak to make it better. But I mean, you have to be able to know when to say, okay, well, no, I'm not going to follow that advice because it's better this way. I mean, if you're a proficient reader, you should be able to tell if a sentence is constructed properly. It's the same thing with like Microsoft Word and other word processors. They have a grammar checker, and it's like, okay, well, I mean, I've seen people sort of slavishly devoted to that thing, and I'm like, well, it's only ever useful at all if you already know grammar really well. In which case, it might actually point out something. You're like, oh yeah, I messed that up. But then, like, if you don't know grammar and you just listen to it, it's just going to completely mangle your prose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I sort of have this policy that I won't follow any ostensible grammar rule that makes it sound like English is my third language. And a lot of grammar rules are like that. With the rule about not ending a sentence with a preposition. Winston Churchill famously mocked this by saying that this is the sort of nonsense up with which I will not put. And it turns out that, the more you study it, the more a lot of these grammar rules were just invented in the 19th century by essentially misguided people who were trying to make English grammar look more like Latin grammar because they just liked Latin. And actually, this is something else that Ursula K. Le Guin discusses in her book, The Language of the Night, about sort of language in writing. Was the first time actually I had come across this. But, the English language desperately needs a gender indeterminate singular pronoun. And for all of history, it's been they. And this is how everybody talks and has talked throughout all of English language history. And relatively recently, some people decided that they shouldn't be permissible as a gender indeterminate singular pronoun, which leaves the English language without one. You're supposed to just say he, maybe, even if you don't actually mean he. And it just creates this huge problem. And so as a writer and just as a person, as a podcaster, it just leaves you with this huge problem where people have this idea of what the rule is, and even if they're wrong, they don't know that they're wrong. So you have to say, well, do I follow this stupid rule that's wrong and have people think that they're smarter than me or not? It's just very frustrating.
Well, that's one of the things that you have the power to do as a writer is, if you just use grammar how you think it should be used, and, in cases like that, just insist on using, they instead of saying he or she or whatever, eventually that sort of thing will come to change. If enough writers sort of agree with you and they all start using the words the same way that you're using them, eventually it'll just become the norm.
Well, I wonder how many people are listening to this and are quaking in terror at the thought of people like me having the power to determine word usage and grammar usage going forward. And to those people I say, you should be afraid. Be very afraid. And that was our show. Our scary, scary show. Thanks everyone for joining us. If you'd like to share your thoughts about any of the topics we discussed today, we'd love to hear from you. Just go to Tor.com and click on podcasts, and then Geek's Guide to the Galaxy episode 13, and post a comment there. And be sure to join us next week when we'll be interviewing Holly Black, best-selling author of the Spiderwick Chronicles. Her new book, White Cat, deals with a contemporary world in which magic is prohibited by law, and so only criminals have magic. See you then.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Tor.com. For this episode's show notes or to subscribe to this podcast, visit Tor.com and click on Podcasts. For more information about your hosts, visit JohnJosephAdams.com or DavidBarrCurrently.com. Music and voiceover produced by Deadsville 9 Entertainment. If you've enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.